I remember sitting alone in the kitchen after everyone had left that night. The dirty plates were still on the table, and the house was finally quiet. I stared at my reflection in the dark window and barely recognized the woman looking back at me. For years, I had convinced myself that things would get better. I kept telling myself Brandon was under stress. I believed his success would make him happier. Instead, the more successful he became, the colder he became toward me. The next morning, Brandon acted as if nothing had happened. He walked into the kitchen, grabbed a cup of coffee, and started talking about his schedule for the day. Not once did he mention the comments he had made the night before. I watched him leave for work and realized something important. He truly believed I would never leave. He thought I would always be there no matter how badly he treated me. That realization hurt more than any joke he had ever made. Over the next few weeks, I stopped trying to earn his approval. I stopped defending myself when he criticized me. I stopped arguing when he spoke to me with disrespect. Instead, I quietly observed. The more attention I paid, the more I noticed changes in him. He spent more time away from home. Business trips seemed to happen more often. Some nights he came home very late and immediately locked himself in his office. Whenever I asked simple questions, he became defensive. His answers felt rushed, as if he wanted the conversation to end as quickly as possible. Something didn't feel right. One evening, while Brandon was in the shower, his phone rang on the kitchen counter. I wasn't trying to invade his privacy, but a message appeared on the screen before the call ended. The name wasn't familiar. A few seconds later, another message appeared. Then another. My stomach tightened. I didn't know who the person was, but I knew one thing for certain. Brandon was hiding something from me. And for the first time in years, I decided I was going to find out exactly what it was. As I started paying closer attention to Brandon's behavior, I found myself thinking about the early years of our marriage. Back then, life was completely different. We lived in a small apartment with old furniture and unpaid bills sitting on the kitchen counter. Brandon had big dreams, but dreams didn't pay rent. While he worked on building his company, I worked wherever I could. Some weeks I barely had time to rest. I remember leaving for work before sunrise and coming home exhausted. Still, I believed in him. Whenever he felt discouraged, I reminded him why he started. Whenever he wanted to quit, I pushed him to keep going. There were months when my paycheck covered almost everything. I handled the household expenses, tracked every dollar, and made sure we stayed afloat during difficult times. When Brandon needed money for new equipment, I used part of my savings. When he needed help organizing paperwork, I stayed up late helping him. I never saw his dream as separate from mine. I thought we were building a future together. As the company grew, our financial problems slowly disappeared. We moved into a larger house and started living more comfortably. At first, I felt proud every time I saw Brandon succeed. But something changed over the years. The appreciation disappeared. Whenever people congratulated him, he accepted all the credit without mentioning the sacrifices that helped him get there. He spoke as if he had built everything completely alone. At business events, he introduced me as his wife, but rarely anything more. It felt like my role in his journey had been erased. The man who once asked for my advice now ignored my opinions. Decisions that used to involve both of us were made without any discussion. What hurt the most wasn't the lack of recognition. It was watching someone I loved become a person I no longer understood. Success had given Brandon everything he wanted, yet he seemed less grateful than ever. The more I thought about our past, the clearer things became. I hadn't changed nearly as much as he had. And for the first time, I began wondering whether the man sitting across from me each night was the same man I had married all those years ago. After that realization, I stopped ignoring the small things that had been bothering me for months. Brandon's schedule no longer made sense. He often stepped outside whenever his phone rang. If I entered the room while he was talking, he immediately ended the call. When messages appeared on his screen, he quickly turned the phone face down. At first, I tried to convince myself that it was business-related. His company was growing, and maybe he was dealing with sensitive information. But the excuses became harder to believe. One evening, Brandon told me he was leaving for a 3-day business trip to Chicago. 2 days later, I received a call from a company employee who casually mentioned that an important meeting had been canceled weeks earlier. The comment stayed in my mind. If there was no meeting, why had Brandon gone? A few weeks later, I attended a company event with him. During the evening, I overheard 2 employees discussing recent company expenses. They quickly stopped talking when they noticed me nearby, but I had already heard enough to become concerned. They mentioned expensive purchases that didn't seem connected to any business project. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Over the next several days, I quietly began paying attention to details. I reviewed financial statements that I still had access to and noticed several large transactions I couldn't explain. The amounts were significant. When I asked Brandon simple questions about them, he became irritated and told me not to worry about company matters. His reaction only increased my suspicions. The more I looked, the more inconsistencies I found. Dates didn't match. Certain expenses seemed hidden. Some trips appeared to have different purposes than the ones Brandon described. Then I found something that made my heart sink. One of the unexplained expenses was connected to an apartment lease. An apartment I had never heard about. I sat in silence, staring at the document for several minutes. At that moment, I knew this was bigger than money. Brandon wasn't just hiding financial information. He was hiding part of his life. I felt angry, hurt, and confused, but I refused to confront him without proof. If there was a truth being kept from me, I wanted every piece of it. And I wasn't going to stop until I found it. I knew I needed facts, not guesses. The documents I had found raised serious questions, but they weren't enough. I wanted the truth before making any decisions. After several days of thinking, I contacted a private investigator. It was one of the hardest calls I had ever made. Part of me still hoped there was an innocent explanation for everything. I wanted to believe that I was wrong. The investigation lasted several weeks. During that time, I continued acting normally at home. I didn't ask Brandon difficult questions. I didn't let him know I was looking into his activities. Then the investigator called. The moment I sat down and opened the report, my entire world changed. The woman from the messages had a name. Vanessa Brooks. She worked for Brandon's company. The report included photographs of them together outside work. There were records showing repeated meetings, overnight stays, and trips that had nothing to do with business. My hands were shaking as I looked through the evidence. The affair had not been a short mistake. It had been going on for a long time. But the betrayal didn't stop there. The investigator also uncovered financial records connected to Vanessa. Brandon had been spending large amounts of company money on her. There were luxury hotel stays, expensive jewelry purchases, designer gifts, and payments connected to the apartment lease I had discovered earlier. The more I learned, the worse it became. I felt sick, angry, and heartbroken. Still, I refused to react emotionally. Crying in front of Brandon would only warn him that I knew the truth. So I stayed quiet. As more information came in, I learned something else that surprised me. Brandon wasn't worried about getting caught. According to conversations the investigator documented, he believed I would never leave him. He spoke about me as if I had no options and nowhere else to go. He was completely confident that I would accept whatever he did. That confidence gave him a false sense of safety. He never imagined I was collecting evidence. He never imagined I was paying attention. And he definitely never imagined that every secret he was hiding was slowly becoming part of a file that could destroy everything he had worked so hard to build. So instead of confronting him, I kept gathering proof. The truth was finally clear. Now I needed a plan. After learning the truth, I stopped thinking like someone who was only trying to survive. I started thinking like someone who needed control over her own life again. I didn't tell anyone what I knew. On the outside, everything stayed the same. I still lived in the same house, still shared meals at the same table, still answered when Brandon spoke to me like nothing had changed. But inside, I was building something new. I quietly met with professionals who could help me understand my situation better. I didn't go to just one person. I spoke with different experts so I could compare answers and be sure I wasn't being misled. Each conversation made things clearer. There were parts of our financial history I had never fully understood before. When I finally saw everything properly laid out, I realized something I had never expected. My early contributions were not just small help. They were part of the foundation of what his business had become. Some of the money I had invested in the beginning had been used in ways that gave me more ownership than I had ever been told. It was difficult to process. For years, I had believed I was simply supporting him. Now I was learning I had been part of building something much larger than I was given credit for. At the same time, I made sure to collect and organize everything carefully. Emails, financial reports, records, and every detail I had discovered about his hidden life were stored in a safe place. Nothing was left scattered or unprotected. At home, Brandon continued his usual behavior. He still spoke to me with disrespect in front of guests. He still acted as if my presence in his life was unimportant. Sometimes he even made jokes that made others laugh while I stayed silent. But I no longer felt the same way I used to. I was no longer reacting to him. I was preparing. Every time he underestimated me, it reminded me that he had no idea what was coming. He thought I was still the same person who would accept everything quietly. He didn't realize I was already planning my next steps. And for the first time in a long time, I felt steady instead of broken. I wasn't just holding on anymore. I was getting ready for the moment when everything would finally change. That night felt different from the beginning. The house was filled with guests again, people Brandon wanted to impress. The dining room was bright, full of conversation and forced laughter. I sat in my usual place, watching everything carefully, saying very little. Brandon was in his element. He enjoyed having an audience. He liked being the center of attention, especially when it made him look more powerful. As the evening went on, his comments toward me became sharper. At first, they were small remarks, the kind he often made in front of others. But slowly, they became more direct. He spoke about my role in his life as if it had no value. He made it sound like everything I had ever done was unimportant. Some guests shifted uncomfortably. A few laughed, but it didn't sound natural. It felt forced, like they were unsure whether they should join in or stay quiet. I didn't react. I kept my expression steady and my voice calm whenever I was spoken to. Inside, I was observing every word, every reaction, every person around the table. Brandon mistook my silence for defeat. He always had. What he didn't understand was that I was no longer the same person who used to argue or defend herself. I didn't need to prove anything in that moment. I already knew the truth, and I was working on what came next. While the dinner continued, I had already moved forward in ways he couldn't see. Meetings had been completed. Documents had been reviewed. Legal steps had been prepared carefully, without rushing or revealing anything. Everything was in place quietly, without him noticing. Later that night, after the guests left, Brandon acted proud of himself. He seemed satisfied, as if he had once again reminded everyone of his importance and my supposed lack of it. He had no idea that his confidence was slowly working against him. The more he spoke carelessly, the more evidence he created about who he really was. At the same time, I learned something important through everything I had been reviewing. The way certain funds were handled, and the decisions made behind closed doors, could create serious problems for him if they ever came to light. Real problems. Not just personal ones, but professional consequences that could reach far beyond our home. That realization changed everything for me. This was no longer just about betrayal. It was about everything he had built. And I was finally ready to decide what would happen to it. The night of the dinner felt different the moment I stepped into the room. Everything was arranged perfectly, just like Brandon liked it. The table was full, the lights were bright, and the guests were important people from his business world. Everyone looked relaxed, talking and smiling as if nothing could go wrong. I stayed quiet and watched. Brandon was already in a good mood. He enjoyed nights like this because it gave him a chance to show control and confidence. He greeted everyone warmly, but when he looked at me, there was the same familiar tone in his eyes. As dinner continued, he began speaking about me the way he always did in front of others. His words were sharp, designed to make people laugh at my expense. A few guests smiled nervously, unsure how to react, while others stayed silent. I didn't respond. I waited. My hands were steady, my thoughts clear. I wasn't there to argue anymore. I wasn't there to defend myself. I was there for something else entirely. When Brandon leaned back in his chair and prepared to continue his remarks, I stood up. The room slowly went quiet. At first, no one understood what was happening. Even Brandon looked surprised that I interrupted him. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't show anger. I simply started speaking in a calm, steady tone. Then I placed the first document on the table. People shifted in their seats. The energy in the room changed immediately. I explained what it was. Then I showed another page. And another. Photographs followed. Records. Emails. Each piece added more weight to what I was saying. Brandon's expression changed as he realized what was happening. He tried to interrupt me, tried to laugh it off, tried to deny what was being shown. But the evidence was already in front of everyone. The room, once full of noise, became completely silent. No one was laughing anymore. People who had once admired him were now watching carefully, processing every detail. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to argue. Everything I needed was already there. Brandon's confidence started to break in real time. He looked around the table, searching for support, but the faces he saw were no longer on his side. For the first time, he had nothing to say, and everyone in the room could see it clearly. The days after that night felt like everything around Brandon started falling apart at once. At first, he tried to act normal, like nothing had changed. He still went to work, still answered calls, still walked into meetings with confidence. But the atmosphere around him was no longer the same. People looked at him differently. Conversations became shorter. Smiles disappeared quickly when he entered a room. The investors who once trusted him began pulling back slowly. Some stopped returning his calls. Others suddenly needed time before making any decisions. Deals that once felt certain started slipping away without clear explanations. Brandon didn't understand it at first. He kept saying it would pass, that people would forget, that it was just a misunderstanding that would settle down with time. But the situation kept getting worse instead of better. Even his close circle of friends started distancing themselves. People who used to admire his success now questioned his behavior quietly. The respect he once enjoyed was disappearing in a way he could not control. At home, the tension grew heavier. Brandon became more stressed, more impatient, and more defensive. He tried to reach out to people who no longer wanted to be involved. Every attempt seemed to push him further into frustration. During this time, Vanessa also stepped away from his life. Once the benefits and attention were no longer there, she stopped showing interest. Her absence hit Brandon harder than he expected, leaving him even more isolated. He tried to fix things, but nothing worked. Every conversation seemed to lead back to the same problems. The trust he had broken could not be rebuilt easily, and the consequences kept spreading into every part of his life. Meanwhile, I focused on what came next for me. Legal steps moved forward carefully. I made sure everything was handled properly and fairly. It wasn't about rushing anything. It was about securing what was rightfully connected to my past and the years I had invested in the life we built together. Slowly, I started feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. For years, I had lived under pressure, always adjusting myself to fit into someone else's world. Now I was finally stepping out of it. Brandon, on the other hand, was beginning to understand something he had never considered before. The woman he spent years dismissing was no longer standing in the same place, and he no longer had control over the outcome. Life slowly started to feel different after everything settled. For the first time in years, I was not waking up with stress sitting on my chest. I had space to breathe, think, and make decisions without someone controlling every part of my day. I moved into a new home that felt peaceful. It wasn't just about the house itself, but what it represented. It was mine. Every corner, every room, every choice inside it belonged to me and no one else. I began managing my own finances and learning more about investments. At first, it felt unfamiliar, but with time I became more confident. Every small success made me trust myself a little more. I also started reconnecting with people I had drifted away from over the years. Some were old friends, others were family members who had always cared but stayed distant during difficult times. Their presence reminded me that I was never truly alone, even when I felt like it. With each passing month, I felt stronger. My thoughts were clearer, my decisions more certain. The version of myself that had been buried under years of pressure was slowly coming back. Brandon's life, on the other hand, looked very different now. The respect he once had in his professional circle continued to fade. Opportunities that used to come easily were no longer available. People hesitated before trusting him, and many chose to step away completely. He tried to fix things, but the damage was already done. His words no longer carried the same weight they once did. Sometimes he would reach out to me. The messages were always similar at first. He would say he had changed, that he finally understood what he had lost, and that he wanted another chance. I always listened. I never reacted with anger. I let him speak. But my answer never changed. I could hear the regret in his voice, but it didn't erase what had happened. It didn't remove the years of being treated like I didn't matter. I understood something important during that time. Forgiveness doesn't always mean going back. Sometimes it simply means letting go of the anger while still choosing to move forward without the person who caused the pain. I had already made my choice, and for the first time, I didn't feel the need to explain it to anyone. Nearly a year passed before I saw Brandon again. He asked to meet in person, saying it was important and that he needed to talk without distractions. I agreed, not because I expected anything new, but but because I felt I no longer needed to avoid the past. We met at a quiet place where no one knew us. When I arrived, he was already sitting there, looking different from the man I used to know. He seemed tired, less confident, almost unsure of himself. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he finally began talking. His voice was slower, heavier. He admitted that he had taken my support for granted for a long time. He said he never truly understood the value of what I gave to him, not just in the beginning, but throughout everything we built together. He looked down as he continued, saying that his attitude, his pride, and the way he treated me had destroyed something important. He didn't blame anyone else this time. He said clearly that it was his own choices that led to losing the life he once had. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, the silence between us felt long. Then I spoke calmly. I told him I accepted what he said. Not because it changed the past, but because I no longer carried the need for anger. What happened had already shaped both of our lives in different ways. But I also made it clear that my decision remained the same. Some things cannot be undone, even with regret. He didn't argue. He didn't try to convince me anymore. He simply nodded, as if he finally understood that part. When I stood up to leave, I felt something light inside me. Not sadness, not anger, just finality. There was no more weight pulling me back. I walked away knowing I didn't need his approval, his apology, or his understanding to move forward with my life. Outside, the world felt open again. I had built a life that didn't depend on anyone else's opinion. My choices were my own, and my future belonged to me. Brandon stayed behind, watching me leave. And in that moment, he finally understood something he should have seen long ago. The woman he had mocked, dismissed, and underestimated for years was never weak. She had always been the strongest person at the table.